So again, welcome all people start to log in. I'm gonna have to apologize because I've got a lot of noise in the background that they're cutting down a tree next door and there's nothing I can do about it. So I'll apologize in advance. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I see a good number of folks have logged in. I see we have Andrew online. And maybe what I'll do is ask Andrew to introduce himself at one point. Maybe what we can do, I can't quite see everybody on the same screen. So I don't actually see Andrew. There's Andrew. If you want to turn on your video and introduce yourself real quick. So I wanted to say welcome to Andrew. Andrew, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm a conservation biologist from University of Derby.
Guys, can you be quiet? I'm on like a work Zoom. Thanks.
Emily, can you please mute yourself?
Sorry.
Okay, I've worked with Gillian off and on for about 5 years. Helped organise the student conference last April. And there's a bunch of my students just ticking in. It's just gone 8 p.m. here, so it's kind of evening, hence the lights on and it's dark. But hello everybody, it's nice to see you all. Is that okay, Gillian?
That was pretty good. We can all give Andrew a quick wave. So wave. And I can't get everybody on one screen, so all of you guys on screen 2, I'll just keep waving at you, and screen 3. So one thing that may be useful as this now sort of grows is that if we could all, I think you have the ability to rename yourselves in your screen. I think these are Sarah's H's students who have the S's next to their name. It might be useful that we put our university's abbreviation next to our name. So like UD for Derby, LM for La Molina University, etc. That may help us all get through this increasingly wonderfully complex class. And I'm so excited that we're all here. So as I get started, Sarah W., I assume you will run the slides and share your screens and let me know when you're ready. I see Sarah W., but I don't hear any response yet. Oh, there she goes. Okay, so a couple of things that we'd like to do this class. Number one is sort of, we'll do a share of a welcome and so forth, and do remind everyone to keep their mics muted, especially as the size grows, to make sure that we have good clarity. And we do understand most people will probably leave their videos off to keep the bandwidth clear. So Sarah, go on to the next slide. What we'd like to do is first a big welcome to the University of Derby students. It is 8 p.m. at night for them, so we have to keep us lively, make sure everybody stays awake in the evening or they're eating their dinner. We'll welcome, and I'm not sure how many will join today, the University of, Monash, University in Australia is joining. And they will be probably mostly at the Yay Fellow level. So we will talk more about that on Monday with our Yay Fellows. But we're going to do a little bit of changing of the format of these lectures and talk a little bit about that. For each lecture, we'll do make sure we have some time for team building and participation for all the SDG teams. We'll keep our lectures short so that they are sort of interactable. And we will have discussion sections. So starting next week, we will have a guest lecture. We'll have guest lectures for the next following 4 weeks that will talk on different topics. Next week will be sustainability in business. And we're bringing a CEO from business from California in for the discussion. And the SDG 12 team will be the host for
Gillian, you just muted yourself, FYI.
I just saw that. Let's go on into the next slide. So I want to take a little bit of time to talk about team participation because it's important for how this team works and part of the goals of this project. And one thing to make sure that we note is that all the universities have different cultures, structures, and time zones, and we just need to celebrate those differences and not let them become barriers. So let's go on to the next slide. I'd like to highlight a couple of things about team building. And I'm going to ask Sarah G, actually, and Andrew to sort of jump in as you would like, because many of us have worked on these large international cross time zone teams. So the number one on virtual business teams or virtual type business teams, it's we have to do a little bit of addressing our interpersonal connections. So we'll hopefully ask folks to share just a little bit about yourself and your team so people understand your, who you are, what your background is as you come to a team. And this becomes challenging on teams that work virtually and don't have the opportunity necessarily to meet in person. Next slide. We also need to keep in front of us that teams are multicultural, and most professional teams, as we move forward in this world of online learning, but also with the work I've done in the UN in the past, that almost all of our teams are multicultural. So sometimes just being careful on how we translate words, for example, to make sure we're clear in our teams and how our teams work together. So again, with the Yale Fellows, just sort of celebrating that multiculturalism, it's going to be an important part of this project. Next slide. And the other thing I'd like to highlight, and hopefully as we all move to the UN COP structures and our own virtual conferences, and Andrew can jump in a second here, but most conservation conversations are highly collaborative and also tend to work across multiple time zones and may often be connected via computer and other things. And we tend not to think about that much because conservation seems to be an outside conversation. But it is important that when we talk about conservation of species, conservation of landscapes, those things cross international boundaries all the time, and learning how to work across those boundaries and cultures and time zones is important. Next slide. This was a fun one from my time at the State Department. You always have to learn, whenever we worked in the State Department, we worked on fish. We always had to learn how to toast in many different languages. Of course, when you go to Russia, you don't want to drink the water because it could be vodka, which we learned the hard way in Russia. But it is just important to celebrate those differences and learn how that team, like if we're going to set expectations for our teams, how those teams come together. We're going to meet on a Saturday or Sunday. What are the religious or observations holidays that we have to be mindful of? Next slide. I think the last one or two things to highlight is that what we have our goal for this week for our SDG teams to sort of start narrowing down to targets. And this topic becomes your common sense of purpose. Why is this team here? What are we working on? What is our unity? A great fortune to work on the women's major group of the UN, and a lot of unity across multiple cultural spaces on what we're trying to do to address equality and equity in the UN global space. Next slide. So a couple of things we need to sort of let go of, and just from the Slack conversations and other things we've been watching, we thought it'd be useful to remind everyone, we need to let go of time zones. As Andrew mentioned, his students are going into their evening. Australian students will be in the middle of the night. Some of our Eastern students are at the end of their day, California students are at the beginning of their day. So it's just important just to celebrate that. We all work in that time zone now. Sarah Green and I worked on a UN project that was based out of Nairobi. So they had the annoying habit of offering meetings that for us were 5 a.m. in the morning or 4 a.m. in the morning. And that was just part of working in that space. Celebrate the differences in institutional cultures. Institutions start their semesters at different times. They work at different speeds. Our Colorado College colleagues are moving through a very fast paced curriculum, so we need to work and be mindful of their need for a different speed than some of the other students. Andrew's class is just starting. So just be respectful of your teammates. Understand it's a very different space for us all to work in. Commit to those meeting times and stick with it. Many students have grades associated with this teamwork, so it's important for us all to be mindful of the ability for that team to move forward so everyone can get a satisfactory grade at the end. So last thing before I transition, going on to the next slide, key points to highlight. As the Prime Minister Fiti said, we are all in the same canoe. Everybody across the world is dealing with this online community. Celebrate those differences, share things, share your pictures when you're comfortable, share other things. But this working on a virtual team across multiple time zones is going to be a new norm, I think, for many of us. Even within our institutions, as some students log in from home, which could be in a different time zone. So next slide, I just wanted to highlight that a little bit. So as we work with our teams and we work with our YAY fellows and we welcome our new team members from Derby, that they have time to become engaged in your teams and we have time to work together. So at the end of each lecture, starting this week and through the rest of the semester, we will spend about half an hour at the end of each lecture, so those teams do have the opportunity to get together. But we do want to be mindful that your team also will meet at other times based on what you and your YAY fellows decide is an appropriate time for your team to meet. So if I don't see any questions in the chat box, if anyone wants to raise any questions in the chat box, Andrew or some of the other professors online, would you like to jump in and say some comments real quick?
I can chip in. Yeah, I mean, I share your experience of working kind of in international groups. I used to do a lot with SCB groups and global SCB groups, and there was always meetings at 3 a.m. Often in my pajamas with the video turned off because I just got out of bed and rolled into the meeting and then rolled back into bed after the meeting. So yeah, I completely share that. But it's exciting, you know, meeting different people, sharing the cultures, sharing experiences, having a comparison of our different equally failing governments is really quite interesting. So yeah, I just share those experiences, Gillian.
Yeah, I agree that it's super exciting to work in groups like this where people are from everywhere. And I think it's a bit even more challenging now because even though our groups that we've been involved in internationally met a lot by phone at crazy times of the day. For me, it was usually 7 a.m., not 5, because I'm closer to Nairobi than Gillian is. But I think it's going to be especially challenging now to find ways to make interpersonal connections, since we normally would have a chance to meet in person at least once or twice sometime before or after in the middle of a project. So I think it's important for your groups to take a few minutes at each meeting to, you know, share some personal things or pretend you're having coffee, or maybe even organize a coffee group for some informal getting to know times, because a lot depends on building that trust and getting to know each other.
And I think I'd like to chime in. For all the reasons that Gillian and others have said, this was an opportunity that was irresistible for me, even though I knew that our schedule was so different. So just to confirm what Gillian said, that our classes last for 3.5 weeks and students only take them one at a time. So we're in the middle of week 2, so approaching halfway through the class already. And the important message to the whole group is that we don't mean to step on any toes or be obnoxious. Our students are going to be trying to complete a Talanoa dialogue circle sometime next week or the weekend after that. And we hope that many of the other students and fellows on those teams will be able to participate in those Talanoa dialogue circles. And at the same time, we don't expect to obligate them to do so. And we don't mean to be obnoxious that we're on such a short timeline, but we're really delighted still to be able to be part of all of this. And I hope as many of my students as can and want to will continue through the whole semester, just opting in.
Thank you. And I thought I saw Pam online, so maybe see if Pam wants to jump in, talk from her perspective.
Sure. I'll just say I agree with everything that has been said already, that it's just so important to be open-minded. Don't make assumptions. Oftentimes tension arises because people jump to conclusions. So if you're feeling something, speak up, be above board, and try to be as constructive as possible.
Thanks, Pam. And I actually should remind us all to make sure we introduce ourselves with our institutions. So Pam was from Boston University, Sarah H. is from Colorado College, Andrew's from University of Derby, and who did I miss? Sarah G. is from Michigan Tech. So it's important we all do that. I see there's a couple of notes in Slack that some people are joining for the first time, and yes, we will go through how the SDG groups, and we will have time today for all the SDG groups to meet, because we think that's really important. So what I'm going to do really quickly, and I'm going to ask Sarah Green, who's going to help tag team, and others who've been involved in the UNFCCC, you know, jump in the chat box or just interrupt me as we go along so we hear multiple voices. I'm going to highlight a little bit of the road to Paris. And this leads us well from our previous discussion, because the road to Paris really moved because the UNFCCC moved towards a team-like structure, putting things together in teams or in UN speak coalitions that worked together to try and get the broader agreement to move in a different place. So what I'm going to do real briefly is to introduce you to that structure, go through some slides fairly quickly before we break to our breakout groups. But for everyone joining, we do keep all these slides and make slide as a slide library, so you can actually go back and look at the Zoom recordings later. And part of our idea of switching to this structure is that the lectures are short, and so you don't have to listen to the entire hour, half of lecture to get to the core materials. So this is on the road to Paris. If you go to the next slide, what's important to realize what happens again, that if you go all the way back to what was known as COP15 in Copenhagen, that was seen as a COP that essentially failed for several reasons. But that was in the year 2000. Oh God, I'm going to date myself. I have to actually think about it. So it's the year that Obama was elected. And the Kyoto Protocol was coming to an end. It was going to end the next year or so. So the world was looking for a mechanism to address the greenhouse gas changes. Now, understand that you're going to see a lot of terminology about the Kyoto mechanism, and the parties to the Kyoto mechanism still meet. However, the Kyoto Protocol itself had, I'm not sure, someone can correct me, that had a true expiration date that came into play. So one of the things that happened was looking at other ways to get the country, the world, to consensus around how to deal with greenhouse gases and climate change. And it took the UN process several years to get there, but it also took the multicultural lenses that brought agreement to that. So the first one of those lenses that was implied was in South Africa in Durban, and that was called the Indaba, on how people come together as groups to create consensus around an ideas. And the Indaba was a listening session on how we listening follow Zulu tradition, and the country of South Africa was the host for COP17. So 2 years after the Copenhagen generally conceived failure to come to agreement. Next slide. So why that was important is that as these coalitions built, we could create what they called the road to Paris that actually passed through Lima. So the Lima Action Plan was one of the big pieces, and that was actually the year before the Paris Agreement was in Lima, Peru, and was a critical to building what they call the road to action to Paris. So thinking about bringing all 190 countries together sort of makes our team effort pale in comparison. We only have 10 universities involved instead of 192. How we built coalitions to get consensus and get a common sense of purpose among all the different countries was really important. And that is the foundation of the Paris Agreement. And a quick reminder, again, everyone please mute your, oh, somebody jumping in, or is that a need to mute a mic? Okay, I think that was a need to mute a mic. So do post some questions in the chat box. Just a quick reminder that in the UN, we talked about a couple of weeks ago, all countries, all bodies of the UN operate with consensus, with the exception of the Security Council. So that means you have to get all 191 countries to agree on something. Next slide. So I think when we look at Paris, it's important that we look at that consensus, and the term that they use in the UN, which you'll hear me use quite a bit, is in hearing no objections, it is so decided. So it operates on this idea that if you don't have an objection and are able to go with the proposal on the floor, that we move forward. And that was an important different step in many ways to get that consensus to move forward, especially for the Paris Agreement itself. Next slide. So a quick reminder to our new students, and I know we'll get some background in other classes and from your own professors. The UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is one of the 3 Rio conventions set up in the UN in 1992. So this year will be the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, which parties is country in UN terms. That means all the countries get together. They're actually skipping this year and they will meet in 2021. And what you'll see in all the slides is this oddball mention to CMP, which are the parties that meet with the mechanisms for the Kyoto Protocol. And that is their 16th meeting. So which means they have met 10 less years for that. So Sarah Green reminds us that she was actually in the State Department at that time. Sarah, do you want to jump in for a second?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm not sure if this is quite the, yeah, this is the time. So I was in the State Department from 2013 to 2014. So this was 2 years, a year and a half and 2 years before the Paris Agreement. And at that time there was frenzied activity because John Kerry had put climate change at the top of his agenda. He basically told all ambassadors that every time they talked to anybody in other countries, in the countries they were stationed in, they had to bring up climate change. So diplomats were supposed to be talking about it all the time. But specifically at the diplomatic front, the focus with the group I was in was to bring China, to allow China and the US to make a joint agreement supporting efforts towards the Paris Agreement, a joint statement. And that took years and years and years of diplomatic work. So just some of the preliminaries is that they had set up, and there were 2 meetings, I think, while I was there. They had set up initially a scientific and technology cooperation group, and I can't remember what it was called, but with the idea of science diplomacy, you might have heard of, which is the idea that even groups or countries that are very distant politically might be able to find common ground in cooperating on science, or cooperating in culture, or cooperating in sports. So all sorts of different diplomacies that kind of get around the political, some political conflicts. So in this case, it was science and technology for sustainability and climate mitigation. And they had several meetings where they had a lot of technical people, and that led into the recognition by both US and China that yes, we could do this. We could do this mitigation. And so that, and then the US and China made an initial announcement that they were going to support this mechanism. And that, of course, being the 2 biggest emitters in the world, allowed a lot of other countries to jump on board. I'm going on too long, I'm going to stop.
Thank you. I do see there is a question, but I also want to acknowledge that Javier is on the line, and Javier was part of the team in Lima that was doing the Road to Action. So I don't know, Javier, if you want to just share a quick perspective of being in Lima at the time and what it felt like to be the university, one of the universities hosting while the COP was in Lima.
Hi, Gillian. Thanks. Hello to all. Yes, it was. We were part with our current president, Dr. Enrique Flores. We were part of the La Molina delegation, that went to participate in the COP in Lima. Thanks to Gillian, and we were part of the Colorado team, and we had a chance also to give, well, actually, Dr. Flores was the one that gave a speech on behalf of the Ringo group, the research association, and related with climate change, where we belong now, and was really nice to participate there. That was in 2014.
Thank you, Javier. And I guess it's actually fun because we're gonna have dogs barking in the background here
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
One of these
That's-
common problems of online teaching is dogs in the background.
exactly.
But as Javier said, one of the exciting things about Lima was bringing different host universities were brought to make statements about the role of science in the negotiation process itself. And that became a pattern that continues. And you can actually find Enrique Flores' statement in the UN website if you go back to the Lima meeting, because all of it is recorded and is archived in the UN. So that's actually kind of a neat exercise. You can go back and see Enrique give his speech, which I think ended up being at like 3 a.m. in the morning or something crazy. By the time they got through all the heads of state speaking, we were delegated to a not nice hour of the day for that talk. So that's always a challenge in the UN space. So I see there are a couple of questions in chat box and I'm happy to answer. I see from Chris G, I was asking a question about that joint statement. I think Sarah may have to answer that because I certainly can't answer all of that. But there's been a lot of questions about the virtual conference, and we do have a guest speaker we're hoping to have in November, who is the US negotiator for the Rio +20 and some other UN negotiations. And she talks a lot about the importance of online, in-person negotiations. But for the students, in this group, last year when we went, I think was the first couple of years that we've started to see what is fondly known as "What's Up" diplomacy. And that's because the cell phone app WhatsApp gets used a ton, as does Twitter, to discuss positions among countries, and especially among the smaller countries that don't have large delegations. So you find that there's negotiation going on in the room, there's negotiations going on WhatsApp, and there's also negotiations going on in other spaces. So I think the UN is much more agile than perhaps my own home institution has been in terms of shifting to making virtual spaces work. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in Glasgow, Scotland, and how they look at that new norm of virtual and in-person. And there's certainly some things you lose in that in-person space. And one of those is just that immersions in multicultural space, as Sarah W. and lots of others who are on the call today can attest to, is one of the sort of eye-popping experiences at the UN. But so let's see, other questions, maybe Sarah G. I don't know if I know the name of the negotiations. I was actually in the room, I don't think I have the picture up, when Secretary Kerry in Paris in a session called Earth to Paris, that was actually held on the weekends. That was actually a fun one.
I'll put the link in the chat there. It was November 11th, 2014. US-China joint announcement on climate change and clean energy cooperation. But I got the link here. I'll stick it in the chat.
Thank you. I'm really glad to see lots of questions starting to come up. So the question about the no objection approach, I'd like to spend a moment on that. And I actually took the slide out, so I actually will now have to put it back in for the next talk. So countries have two ways that they negotiate, and one of the biggest, I guess, backgrounds about negotiation is having what they call a red line. So there'll be a point where a country will simply not move past that red line. So the idea of hearing no objections is to provide a gray space for countries to agree upon things. Now, that being said, in the negotiation space, what are known as interventions, which could be, they're a little bit different than objections. An intervention can be anything from adding a single word to changing, I mean, literally all these documents. The Paris Agreement was gone through word by word. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, it's pretty long. So it gives you an idea of the intensity that many of these things are negotiated on. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Those of us who are at Paris, which was an amazing experience, but the whole thing hinged, at the end of the day, hinged on one word that got mistranslated. And that was a powerful moment. The word was shall versus should. and the whole agreement teetered until that thing got corrected. So I'm sure a lot of us can share what that experience was like. But in the interest of time, then you go on to the next slide, because I think I actually will answer that question. And there's a question about what's being most difficult. So let me hold that question. I'm going to talk about it in a hot second here. But I want to remind you, and again, the slides are all available, so don't try and read the whole slide. We're all on different time zones, so you have time to go back and look at it. But I wanted to just highlight very quickly that the UN FCCC is part of a family of treaties and agreements that move throughout the UN space. And why I want to highlight that is because some things will move in one space in a different speed than other spaces. And this is a slide from my colleague, Melinda Kimball, who Sarah Green has also worked with in the UN Foundation, former ambassador for the US and a foreign service officer for the US. She worked on the Montreal Protocol, and we may talk about that later. And understanding where some agreements move at different rates and then how those agreements get incorporated into bigger agreements becomes an important part of how those negotiations work. Now, that being said, going back to, and I apologize if I mispronounced Zofa's question from Michigan Tech, specific agreements can get stuck because of that overlap between other treaties and foundations that are moving around. And Paris, the Paris Agreement, also almost got stuck because of an overlap with the human rights agreements. And then we'll talk about where that shows in the Paris Agreement. So Sarah's giving me a 15-minute check because we will break out at least by, Sarah, hoping we can break out by 2 o'clock and leave the rooms open till 2:30. That's possible. So let's go to the next slide. So again, we have this available. I want you to, the issue of language. Kyoto Protocol basically divided the world into 2 big lumps. One was called Annex 1, those were the developed countries, and the other is called Annex 2. And so part of the reason for the failure of the Kyoto Protocol to move forward and actually get replaced by other mechanisms was this idea of teams and coalitions, and where teams came together or coalitions came together and how they need to be able to work together for common goals, like we're doing in our own teams. So let's go on to the next slide. So part of the key differences going to Paris from Kyoto is all about this idea of working as a team. So you go from an individual country to a whole group of countries like the Ambitious Coalition, asking the Paris Agreement to do 1 or 2 things. And I'll show you what those are. So when you get to that point where you have to ask, such as the earlier question about consensus, you now have a coalition that will speak for 20 countries, or the G77 plus China, which is a coalition, will speak for 77 countries. And so that's how the coalitions and how the consensus works with more power, looking across all 192 countries that are part of that. So, and part of what that does is also get you to new goals. And we'll talk about that later on the semester with the 1.5 goal, which is a critical part of the Paris Agreement, that the Ambitious Coalition, led by the negotiator from Marshall Islands, who was 16 years old, was the spokesperson to get to a more ambitious goal than was originally put aside after the Kyoto Protocol. Next slide. So I can skip over this really quickly, but I wanted to highlight that words matter. And words are really important as you and your teams start to look at your own SDGs, especially things that are associated with the human rights and other types of treaties moving around. One word makes a difference in diplomatic language. So to understand how human rights comes to the Paris Agreement is the word reaffirming, or understanding how oceans move into the preamble of the Paris Agreement, the word may be noting. So it's important to think about this, and perhaps later we can share the moment that the US rejected the IPCC report, and Sarah Whipple was in the room when that happened in Poland, and understanding the arguments over that one word of noting versus acknowledging versus welcoming. that IPCC 1.5 report. Next slide. So the Paris Agreement, most countries ended up submitting what's called individual plans. We won't go into those in a lot of detail. The US did submit their plan, and our plan is part of that agreement. It was submitted in 2015. Everything was officially signed in 2016 with this idea that we had three things moving forward: transparent, ambitious, and differentiated. And this is where the SDGs start to come in. The differentiated is the different goals a country can do to achieve its overarching goal of the Paris Agreement, which is to reduce our emissions, but also to make for sustainable livelihood and long-term longevity of our planet's resources. Next slide. So again, to highlight a couple things, what's important to note in the Paris Agreement, and as you sort of look forward in your teams, is where different mechanisms pop in and either slow down or push the Paris Agreement forward. And throughout the semester, so this is a little background slide, we will talk about these mechanisms. And it's important to note that there is no sort of insurance policy, for example, against loss and damage. And that's coming up right now with all these hurricanes that we're facing. But we're getting back to where does this countries work together as coalitions to try and either get compliance or agreement among other coalitions of countries to get to our common goal. So I see there's a question to everyone about the majority vote. And again, the UN's foundation sits on majority vote. I don't know, Sarah Green, if you want to comment on that real quick.
I'll make a quick comment. I wrote a little chat response to it. One of the problems with majority vote is that it means that somebody votes against it, and then they might feel like they're not bound by it, or they might use that to make political points at home. They might say, well, I voted against that. With a no objection, it's harder to wiggle out, because if you say, well, I didn't agree with that, you say, well, why didn't you make an objection when there was a chance to make an objection? Right? But, and also, as Gillian, I think, was about to say, the UN traditionally, or I think in statute, works by consensus. So the no objection allows a consensus to go forward without having to go around the room and have everybody say, yes, I agree. Is that accurate, Gillian?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. And then I think I have a picture later on, as you can see the size of these rooms to realize that, 192 countries, if you have an objection, it can take you, and actually that's where Copenhagen stalled, as you recall, because countries had a lot of objections and things just don't move forward, and you end up with time going over. And even last year in in Madrid, as you recall, there was some panic for a while. They would not make it to agreement, and they did not make it to agreement on all the mechanisms. So it is an important way to think about majority versus minority in terms of the weight of the country in the room. So if you're a developed country, which is what Kyoto ran into, Canada flat out refused to meet their commitments. So now what? If you're Marshall Islands, can you sort of try and cajole Canada into doing something? It's a little bit harder. However, if you have 17 countries, or in the case of the ambitious coalition, I think there are now 20 countries in that coalition, the quote unquote shaming is a little bit higher to actually push people towards agreements and getting to agreements. So it is a lot about this. It's hard to wiggle out, but it's also a lot about these red lines are known. They're known among the negotiators. They know what countries are likely to dig their heels in. So for example, in the UN world, the Holy See is a party to all these agreements. The Holy See, interestingly enough, has a red line, to leave the politics out, between the terms equity and equality. So if you flip those two terms, which the women's major group likes to sometimes do, the Holy See will raise an objection, and that will stall the negotiation until you can get towards consensus. So it's important to remember. But a nice little sort of side story about the Paris Agreement, I think that's 2 slides down from here, is one of the terms that got stuck on the Paris Agreement, and I'll get to that in a minute, was the term Mother Earth. And that was something that the country of Bolivia was willing to raise an objection until that term was agreed to. So sometimes you have a country that will go solo and bring the whole negotiation to its knees. And the most famous one for that is the country of Tuvalu, which is what brought the Copenhagen Agreement to its knees. A very small country that was going underwater. Next slide. I just want to be mindful of our time here so we have time for our breakout rooms. So in the Paris Agreement, and as we go into our breakout rooms for our SDGs, it's so important to pay attention that words matter. Every individual word in the Paris Agreement is negotiated. So we look at the SDGs actually are a negotiated document. They came out of the Rio +20. That meant, and they were voted on by the UN General Assembly. That means every word in that targets and those goals has been negotiated by all 192 nations. And that process took about 5 years for everything to, some of the targets just got finished up or tidied up fairly recently. So words matter. So pay attention to words as you go through. For my Colorado State students, they know that one of my favorite quiz questions is always to ask, where do forests appear in the Paris Agreement? And you'll see that in a hot second. So just think about that for a minute. Where do forests appear in the Paris Agreement, or where you think they would appear? So the other thing before we get into where our forests actually end up is that the agreement has all these items in it: mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, and each one of these is a mechanism that moves at a different rate of speed during the year, and that's what comes together in the Conference of the Parties. And it's important to sort of know that process. So things are being negotiated right now, and they come together in the Conference of the Parties each year. And most of those negotiations, to go to an earlier question, have virtual components that take place all the time. So this would not be a new process for the UN. So if you go to the next slide, my little cheater question, and Sarah and others might be able to comment on that, is that forests, the term forest in the Paris Agreement actually comes out of COP16 in Cancun, which was this term of trying to reduce emissions from addressing deforestation and land degradation. There's a proposal by the country of Brazil. So when you look at the SDGs 14 and 15, 14 specifically, you guys should be very familiar with this term by the end of the semester. It's called REDD, or REDD+, were two different terms that were put forward by Brazil. And it actually was a finance mechanism on how we could finance carbon from one area of the world to another. So could you balance or bank your carbon against a forest, and it originally was tropical forest, it's since been argued to be temperate forest, that could you balance against forest and forest cover as part of your carbon credit cycle? So again, that quiz question, forests in the Paris Agreement world appear in the finance section. In contrast, if you go to the next slide, again, what becomes important is going back to our earlier, there are other mechanisms moving in the UN that you may have to pay attention to, is human rights. And human rights appear in the preamble, acknowledging there is an existing agreement on the Human Rights Convention that countries have already signed to. So under that, and why it's so important, is it allows for the discussion of climate justice. And for one country's impact on another country, such as a small island state going underwater because of rising sea level rise, SDG 15, or change, loss of water or lack of water, SDG 6, all of these tie into human rights issues, the right to health and well-being, SDG 3, which ties to the Millennium Development Goal, which also has the right to health. Everyone in the world under human rights has the right to good health, right? So polluted waters, pollution, et cetera, are often considered a human rights violation.
Hey, Gillian.
So I would, yeah, go ahead.
Quick comment on human rights is that it hasn't gone away, and sitting in on things at COP, whatever it was we went to last year, 25, it's still, the human rights are still brought up. And one of the things that happens is countries want to put more provisions for human rights in various places. And countries who are not big on having human rights enshrined anywhere will say, oh, but it's already in the preamble. We don't need any more commitment to human rights because it's already in there. So where things are also can be a point of contention.
Yeah, really good point. And the preamble serves a really specific purpose. So give me mindful times. I'm actually going to ask a quiz question of all the students on the line. You can put your answer what you think of in the chat box. So we'll just do this real quick. I don't know how to do polls yet, but Sarah W. I'm sure will educate me soon. So what country do you think has there are actually two countries involved, have a human rights violation in regard to fisheries and indigenous people? There are two countries that are current human violation rights to fisheries and indigenous people. Let me toss some in the chat box. Take a wild guess. Wild guesses are always allowed. Oh man, somebody got it. Carmen is correct. Maybe I gave you too many hints. Sorry, Andreas, it was not Thailand. Thailand actually has a different issue going on. But yes, it's the US and Canada. The US and Canada, does anyone know what chemical is involved here? For all those who got it right. Sarah H, your students are great. They all got this. So for the SDG 12 team, looking at chemicals, that's a hint. This is a chemical issue. Any guesses? Throw out some wild toxic chemicals. Oil, nope. Oil's a compound. What the heck is AS? AG, maybe?
Arsenic. AS is arsenic.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm not a chemist. Okay, you're close. It's a little bit heavier. Most of us have it in thermometers, old style thermometers. Lead, Zach's got lead. Hey, yay! A couple people got it. Everybody's got it. Mercury. So mercury poisoning in fish, and particularly in anadromous fish such as salmon, that the northern native Alaskan tribes, the Yupik and the Chupik people in Canada, and as well as the Inuit people in Canada, have been suing the US and Canada over mercury poisoning and impacts on native children. And that is still in court. I don't know the current status of that, but that is considered a human rights violation. And as you may have seen in the news, the US, on the US news, a group of youth within the US sued the United States government over human rights violations due to climate change. And that lawsuit was not successful, but I think it was still landmark to bring together the right of the future population to healthy planet and to healthy lifestyle. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. I think we only have one or two more slides, and then we need to go into our breakout rooms. So as Sarah G was mentioning, one of the other things that pops up in the Paris Agreement, which is really important in the preamble, is the issue of oceans. And oceans only appear in this agreement, in this one area, and that's in the preamble. And it's important, like I said, to note the word, and literally note the word. It says noting. So this gets into how diplomatic speak changes its impressions or lack of impressions of other conventions, or lack of support of other conventions within one convention. So the oceans are noted that they are addressed elsewhere, is all that is trying to say. And there's been a lot of criticism about the Paris Agreement because it's not adequately addressing SDG 15, for example, and the issue, the lifestyle issues of small island states and ocean level rise. So this is a critical issue you'll hear come up again and again under loss and damage as countries are losing their landscape or being damaged by these events. But again, just to highlight in the preamble where an individual country can bring cultural significance into the language, negotiated language. The country of Bolivia was very specific that the term Mother Earth, not just Earth, but Mother Earth, needed to be included in the Paris Agreement, and successfully through a coalition of countries. So the whole coalition of countries that agreed that this needed to be in the Paris Agreement to represent the cultural connection. And it wasn't until Madrid, where we were very fortunate to witness the acceptance of the Indigenous Peoples and Local Community Platform as part of the Paris Agreement and part of the UNFCCC moving forward to acknowledge Indigenous rights and other such things.
But
So this was the first. Sorry, go ahead.
Notice again, the language here is that most likely the initial proposal was to put something like noting the importance of and integrity of Mother Earth. And some countries said, no, 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 we don't recognize Mother Earth as a concept. And so eventually with wordsmithing, it got around to recognized by some cultures as a modifier, right? So you can see how a compromise comes from people saying, we need it in there, and other people saying we need it out of there, and finally getting to the, we'll put it in there in this slightly watered down form. So you'll see things like this all the way through these kind of documents, which sometimes makes for hard reading. It's kind of legalese.
But it's so important because, again, as Sarah could probably remember, the term that follows shortly on its heels is climate justice. And I believe that was negotiated, if you remember, in the main session at like 2 a.m. in the morning. And I think people are probably like, okay, because they refused to acknowledge terms of climate refugees. They refused to acknowledge terms of environmental racism or environmental injustice. So interestingly enough, what eventually was accepted was the term climate justice and put in quotes.
And again, watered down the importance for some of the concept, for some people who consider this an important concept. Right? But
so you can see how these
so it's a huge win to get it in there, because I'm sure there were many countries who just wanted it out and finally agreed to a slightly modified version of what was originally proposed.
Right, so the important thing about thinking about why does it need to be in there is, again, this is in Paris, 2015, took to 2019 to acknowledge the importance of different cultures within the confines of the Paris Agreement. And not just the Paris Agreement, the entire UNFCCC, which is the overarching convention. The Paris Agreement is one mechanism underneath that convention. So that little word became push of negotiation, especially from civil society groups and others, to make sure that Indigenous cultures and local communities get acknowledged in the agreements. So I see there's a question discussing words and how something is written could lead to a waste of time in negotiations. Well, as a colleague of ours once put, or she had a great slide, that was Tracy Bach from Vermont Law School, great slide about watching paint dry. That's about a good description of negotiations. They're very complex. They move very slowly, but it's important to remember, always a reminder, everything that's negotiated in the UN gets translated to 21 languages. So the Paris Agreement is a great example. It was brought to its knees by a mistranslation of the term shall, which means a country has an obligation, to the word should, which means that company, it'd be nice if they did it, but it's not an obligation. And that shall versus should brought objections by the US, Canada, no, US, Sarah Green helped me up, I think it was US and Saudi Arabia that caught that error. So literally, this was at 1 or 2 in the morning, Friday night. Panic and surge were already 2 days over. Everybody's supposed to leave on Saturday to renegotiate the whole mess to try and correct that error. And they actually were able to fix it and get everybody to agree at midday on Saturday. And literally, a bunch of us were on the plane watching it on the phone. They finally got to agreement. So it's important to think that words, sorry, go ahead.
Another issue about words is that these things become precedent, like a legal precedent. So if the US agrees to a document that says something, then 10 years later or 5 years later, somebody can come up and say, well, you agreed to this. Here's the language that you agreed to. And it gets perpetuated. So it's really important to get it right because it's like writing a law. It needs to be right, so it can't be misinterpreted or misconstrued or weaseled around in a way. And I think that all the discussion about it is tedious and like paint drying, but it does bring out issues that you may have never realized that somebody cared so much about, you know, the pond in Timbuktu that's part of their cultural heritage or something. So it brings to light things that will make the agreement stronger for everybody and more useful for everybody.
And a great example of that is the 1.5 report, which we'll talk about in another class. The term was welcoming versus noting versus acknowledging. And because the 1.5 report pointed at commitments different countries had made to reduce their greenhouse gases would not be sufficient to reach the target, it became a policy issue. That to accept that report or to welcome that report was basically a welcoming that you weren't meeting your own targets or that you were not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So many countries balked at that. And it was one of the sort of, I would say, saddest moments to sit in that room and see it was what US, Saudi Arabia, and Syria working together as 3 countries to object to that report. And you think, okay, what do these 3 countries have in common to object to that report? But that's where the US and where the UN and consensus becomes so important, to try to get all those countries to agree. And the end result was to note the report and not to welcome it, which was really a shame. All right, so it's never a waste of time in the world of diplomacy. It's a redirection of effort, I think would be the way to put it. You know, do you go to war over words? And the answer is yes, all the time. Who has right to one set of water versus a nut? That's one word, right, that can change countries arguing over water sources or going to civil war over it. Okay, so the next one is my last slide because we want to make sure we have time to go into breakout rooms and welcome our new members. So I want to leave you with that thought as we start our work on our Sustainable Development Goals as teams about this words matter. And the Paris Agreement is such a great example of paying attention to words and why these words matter. Why is forests in the finance section? Why do oceans in the preamble? Because that will also tell you in terms of the action or lack of action on some of the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. Because like Sarah said, these are diplomatic documents that try to hold countries accountable for their actions under the space of the UN. And yes, there's also the arguments that go on all the time and countries pull in and pull out of different agreements, but the overarching rule of thumb is to how to get countries to comply with the agreements they've come to. Human rights, you know, how do we comply with that? If you fail to comply, what happens? So the Paris Agreement, what I'll leave you with, is the Paris Agreement built on teams. So our task for you in the next half hour is to work on building your team so that you can come with this common sense of purpose of what you're trying to achieve with your team. It relied on every country contributing to its own ability. And that was so important to recognize that countries had different capacities to address their own internal greenhouse emissions. And as Sarah Green and I can certainly wax poetic later on the issues of shipping and shipping greenhouse emissions and which country is responsible for those, or fisheries and who's responsible for the management of things that move across multiple country boundaries and massive spaces. And shipping and fishing are 2 that pop out surprisingly. But more importantly, the Paris Agreement builds on a foundation around ambition. And what's important to recognize that the Paris Agreement builds basically in 3 different areas. It builds on the environment, it builds on people, and it builds on the economics. And if you look at those are the 3 pillars of sustainability as defined. And those 3 pillars all move into the Sustainable Development Goals. And they link across goals and they link within the goals. And the goals are the mechanism that works behind the scenes for the Paris Agreement. So remember, the goals were signed by the UN General Assembly. The Paris Agreement is signed on the UNFCCC. Both of those are negotiated world diplomatic documents. So it's just important to think about them in that terms. So what I'd like to do next, this is my last slide, is break into our breakout rooms. Now, Sarah W and Sarah G are going to have to jump in with some directions, because I believe there are some directions on how we will go into the breakout rooms. I'll turn that over to Sarah W to share, or Sarah G. I'm sorry, my screen is flashing. In our breakout rooms, we have a couple of tasks that the Yay Fellows in each breakout room should hopefully be up to speed on what we need to do for the next half hour, and make sure that we're all comfortable. So Sarah W, do you want to jump in? And I'll just sort of remind you, the rooms will stay open for 30 minutes. However, I do have to teach another class as the Sarah W, so we may have to cycle out before that 30 minutes is up. But I would urge the teams who all have a Yay Fellow and a lead to work for the full 30 minutes and get yourself organized, meet each other, get some personal time together, and for the newcomers, learn what goals and targets the team has been talking about, etc. So Sarah W, do you need to jump in and give us some instructions? Or Sarah G?
Yeah, so I can start, and Sarah G, feel free to chime in at any time. For those that have already selected themselves into an SDG group, I'm going to open the breakout rooms in just a minute, so that you have the maximum amount of time to get up to speed with your team members. And while we're making that transition, Darby folks, we're going to put you into teams. And so what I will do is I'll open breakout rooms, so those students that are already in a team can start conversation. And then for those in the breakout rooms, just note that you'll have some new students joining. So please welcome them when they have decided on a team. And for those staying in the main plenary, so specifically Darby folks, and I think there are a few folks that I didn't catch your name, you didn't have a team assignment yet. I will share my screen with the team options, so you can get into a team as quickly as possible and join the conversation. And like Gillian said, these will be open for about half an hour. So, you know, take that time. And for Darby folks, I will also ask for email addresses, so I can add you to a platform we use for communication called Slack. So that way you can start to communicate with your team off of Zoom as well. So with that, are there any questions before I open the rooms for those that have teams already?
As they say, hearing no objections, it is so decided.
All right, enjoy. All right, it looks like everyone has